Sandra Moss, MD, MA, is a retired internist with a degree in the history of medicine. Her speaking engagements have included medical history groups, historical societies, libraries, community centers, veterans groups, and more. Her research is focused on the history of medicine in New Jersey and is aimed at both physician and general audiences. Dr. Moss has authored books and contributed close to 40 articles, chapters, and reviews to a wide variety of journals. She is also a past president of the Medical History Society of New Jersey and of the American Osler Society. Sandra, welcome. I'm gonna pass it off to you now.
Okay, and have you got my, let's go to the first slide then. Okay, can you see that, or is there a little sign in the middle of it, or is it coming clear to your screens there? Guess it's okay.
Mhm.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. We're going to start with the three wicked sisters. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, three critical principles derived from English common law governed compensation or lack of compensation for industrial injuries. These laws were so restrictive that they became known as the unholy trinity of defenses, or the three wicked sisters. So I thought we should bring in a little Shakespeare here. The first is contributory negligence. If the worker was in any way responsible for his injury, the employer was not at fault. The fellow servant rule: employers were not to be held liable if the worker's injuries resulted in any part from the action or negligence of another employee. And third, the assumption of risk. This pernicious doctrine held simply that employees knew the hazards of any job when they signed their contracts. Therefore, by agreeing to work at a job, they assume any inherent risk that it carries. In short, occupational hazards were considered normal, part of the price of being employed. An injured worker's only recourse is through the use of torts, expensive legal affairs. Congress passed the Employers' Liability Acts of 1906 and 1908, softening the common law doctrine of contributory negligence. The first comprehensive workers' compensation law was finally passed in Wisconsin in 1911. The last state to pass workers' compensation legislation was Mississippi in 1948. Workers' compensation laws relieved workers of much of the burden of litigation, but it also tended to let employers off the hook. Next slide. Okay, we're going to begin with the mercury family of diseases. Next slide. Bernardino RAMMAZINI, the father of occupational medicine, observed in the 1700s that mirror makers, gilders, and chemists suffered ill effects from breathing the fumes of mercury. Mercury poison had long been recognized among quicksilver miners. Typical signs included salivation with a dry and painful mouth, jerking of the limbs, tremors, and mental changes often associated with blushing and shyness. Mercury vapor was used in the treatment of syphilis, giving rise to the motto, a night of Venus and a year of Mercury, or sometimes they said a lifetime of Mercury. Next slide. In the 19th century, doctors routinely prescribed toxic CALOMEL, the mercury chloride containing laxative from hell. They didn't call it that. To treat a vast range of poorly understood diseases, to essentially purge the evil humors from the body. Doctors of the day were familiar with mercury toxicity: salivation, loose teeth, inflammation of the mouth and gums. Next slide. In the 17th century, French hatters began using acid nitrate of mercury to prepare animal skins for felting. These were military hats and the top hats and so forth. The pelts took on a yellowy carroty color, so the process came to be called carroting. Carroting makes the hairs twisted and rough, which makes the felting easier. Next slide. The original hat fur used in Europe, beaver imported from colonial North America, felted easily. As the beaver trade diminished from overhunting, lesser furs such as rabbit needed far more chemical treatment. Mercury nitrate was added to the heated chemical solution in the 1770s to increase malleability. Mercury vapor was given off into the workshop air. Next. Nationally, the biggest center of hat making was Danbury, Connecticut. The Danbury high schoolers are still known today as the Danbury Hatters. Next, please. In the mid-19th century, Newark and the Oranges, which has nothing to do with the orange color, by the way, the Oranges in Essex County were also important centers of the hatting industry. In 1860, there were an estimated 6,000 hatters in New Jersey. By 1875, there were some 40 shops and factories producing up to 1,000 hats per day. One hat company in Newark made hats for the Union Army. In New Jersey, the waterways were polluted with mercury as well as other industrial wastes. A physician observed that all the running streams of the Orange region were discolored with hat dyes. Next, please. Young Dr. J. Addison Freeman of Orange was probably the first physician, perhaps the first in the world, to give a comprehensive description of mercury poisoning in hatters. His short article appeared in the Transactions of the Medical Society of New Jersey in 1860 and was little noticed. It was, however, a fine piece of research and investigation. The title was A Mercurial Disease Among Hatters. Freeman surveyed factories in Orange, Newark, Bloomfield, and Milburn over a period of months. He observed the classic symptoms, a shaking palsy or tremor, loosening of the teeth and salivation, ulcerated gums, all of which he correctly attributed to the inhalation of air impregnated with mercury vapor. The treatment, such as it was a break from work, unpaid, with recovery and return to work the rule. He also found that the hatters are more affected in winter when the windows were closed, and he advised large, well-ventilated rooms. Sadly, Freeman died at the age of 30 in 1864 while serving as a physician in the Civil War in the Union Army. From the 1860s to the 1940s, health and labor experts gathered statistics and published recommendations such as ventilation hoods, but little was done. Most hatters were recent immigrants, and it was convenient to blame their symptoms on drunkenness or other bad habits, thus justifying their exploitation. Hatter shakes were just part of the job. Next, please. Alice Hamilton of Harvard University, an early leader in industrial medicine, observed in the 1920s, in one of the Oranges, I heard of a hatter whose muscles jerked so violently that he could walk to work only if he pushed a baby carriage in front of him. But once his mates had guided him to his workbench, he could carry on. Hamilton found that many mercury workers showed irritability, depression, and inability to take orders, and seemed to be full of fears. World War II, when mercury was needed for detonators, ended the use of mercury in the hatting industry, and the industry changed. Next, please. I'm sure you're wondering, where did Lewis Carroll in England find his model for the Mad Hatter? Workers and other laymen seem to know about the curious jerking gait, extreme shyness, and stammering speech common to hatters. So perhaps this folk knowledge found its way into Alice in Wonderland. Next, please. Many of you will remember Minimata disease, identified in that Japanese city in 1856. A chemical factory released methyl mercury into the wastewater, and it accumulated in fish and shellfish, entering the human food chain and killing and maiming thousands. Next slide. This iconic photograph by W. Eugene Smith, who had married a Japanese woman and lived in the Minimata area, was a stunning indictment of the operators of the chemical factory and the human misery they left behind. Okay, I'm going to move along to the radium girls. The discovery of X-rays by William Conrad Röntgen in Germany in 1895 revolutionized medical diagnosis and therapy, but radiation was a double-edged sword. Next, please. Radium was discovered by Madame Curie in 1898. Her death from aplastic anemia, which is bone marrow failure, was almost certainly related to her decades of research with radioactive materials. In the 1920s, radium was seen as a mystical medical panacea, pushed entrepreneurs for a staggering array of afflictions, some, quote, glandular afflictions in the euphemistic shorthand of the day. Some physicians supported use of radon or radium for the treatment of arthritic and neurological conditions. Next. Radium water. Americans eagerly drank radium water from jugs incorporating radioactive clay. The jugs were filled daily with water, left to percolate, and then tapped for a refreshing drink. Spas promoted the radium and radon gas content of their spa waters, purportedly health-restoring waters full of radium and radon. The Bailey Radium Laboratories of East Orange sold some 400,000 bottles of a tonic and sexual rejuvenator called Radiothor. Next slide, please. Calling up the images of the Norse god of thunder. It's very sexual sort of references in some of these things. Next, please. The Radium Luminous Corporation stock certificate here was from, of course, the Radium Luminous Material Corporation, founded in 1914 in Newark by physician and scientist Sabin Arnold von Sochocki and his physician partner. The company acquired radium mines out west and produced uranium from carnotite ore. They eventually moved into the business of producing radioluminescent paint. The company relocated in West Orange in 1917 and was renamed the United States Radium Company in 1921. Next. There's an example of a boy's watch. These watches that had luminescent dials were probably of little danger to the people who wore them. They were in greater danger to the people who produced them. The painting of illuminated watch and clock dials at the company began in 1917. The military required luminescent dials for nighttime reading of instruments and timepieces. Radium paint soon became popular for civilian products such as glowing house numbers. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing in the background, and lamp poles. Radium and calcium have similar chemical properties. So radium is deposited in the bones. Radium and its isotopes have long half-lives. The time to decay into radium gas, a radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. Bone toxicity leads to spontaneous fractures, bone death, which is called osteonecrosis, cancers of the bone and bone marrow. Radium can also wipe out blood-forming cells in normal bone marrow, causing aplastic anemia. That's anemia with no cells, and it's often fatal consequences. That watch there was placed on some sort of paper, X-ray paper, probably 100 years after the watch was actually produced, and you can see that the radiation is still present from the numbers on the watch dial. Next, please. Over the next few decades, about 4,000 young women at companies in Orange, Waterbury, Connecticut, and Ottawa, Illinois, painted dials. Most did the work for a few years before they married. Painting about 250 watches a day, they were paid $15 to $24 weekly with better conditions than most factory jobs. By 1919, some 200 women were at work in the Orange factory. Next. Yeah, this is the factory in Ottawa, Illinois. I think hiring, I don't know, looks like hundreds of women, all sitting at their desks. Next. The luminescent paint used by the New Jersey dial painters was a US radium company product called Undark, produced from 1917 to 1938. Radium paint was on the fine tip paint brushes that the women lip pointed. They were trained to do that, to make a sharp tip to paint the narrow lines on the numbers on the watches or clocks. And they sort of wet it with their tongue. Next, please. This famous cartoon, I don't know the date, but I suspect it was rather late, probably well into the 1950s, is from the Hearst newspaper. Surfaces in the factory were covered with radium dust, and there was probably radium in the airborne dust as well. The women noticed that their fingers, hair, and fingernails glowed in the dark, and they sometimes would paint their nails at the end of the day in the factory so that they would sort of glow when they went on their dates with their beaux at night. Next. Several workers and former workers began to develop puzzling dental and jaw problems. Katherine SCHAUB, born into a working class family in Newark, started painting dials at age 15. She ultimately became an instructor for new dial painters. SCHAUB required dental extractions and had ongoing pain. She thought her case was related to that of one of the other girls, but did not make the connection with lip pointing. Some victims of jawbone necrosis, or death of the jawbone, required extensive surgery, including removal of the teeth, and in some cases, removal of the entire lower jaw. The first suspicious death from jaw necrosis occurred in 1922. The worker was Amelia Maggia, one of 5 sisters who worked at the factory. The connection to radium was made mainly by dentists. In 1924, New York physician and dentist Theodore Bloom mentioned radium jaw in an article in the Journal of the American Dental Association. Dentists had seen something called phossy jaw, which was related to phosphorus on the matchsticks. And at first, some of the dentists thought they were looking at phossy jaw. By 1924, 7 radium dial painters had died, but there were no autopsies since the deaths were not considered suspicious. Next, please. Alerted by Orange's health officer, the Consumers League, a women's advocacy organization, referred some of the cases to Dr. Harrison Martland, Essex County medical examiner. By 1925, using autopsy studies, Martland connected the bone disease and aplastic anemia to the radium exposure. There was growing acceptance of the link among scientists and government officials, but industry leaders were slow to accept these conclusions, concealing data and controlling information about radium and thus avoiding liability. Most of the cases occurred years after a woman had left the company, further complicating the issue of responsibility. Next, please. In 1927, 5 women suffering painful deformities and with short life expectancies joined in a lawsuit against US Radium. A federal judge urged the parties to settle so the women could get some compensation before they died. The company had powerful, expensive lawyers. The women had lawyers who were dedicated to their advocacy, but were obviously limited. The women couldn't pay them. They could only, work when they could work on behalf of these women. Each woman got $10,000 and an annual pension of $600, plus money for medical treatment. In all, at least 22 New Jersey dial painters died of radium poisoning. The last, a sister of the first victim in 1922, died in 1946. In 1926, radium poisoning came under the Workmen's Compensation Act, but it could not be made retroactive. A court also ruled in later suits that the company had not fraudulently concealed knowledge of harm, which was untrue. They knew there was knowledge of harm. In fact, when the women went for their annual physicals, that was one of the perks that they got. They were always told everything was normal, when indeed it wasn't. Next, please. Oh, no, not next, back, I guess. We didn't do that one. Okay. Some of the scientists who directed radium companies had themselves worked with radium. So Chalky, founder of US Radium, died from bone marrow failure in 1928, as did a chemist with the company. The suffering of New Jersey's dial painters and the investigations that followed stimulated the new fields of radiobiology and health physics and helped shape standards for other industrial and medical workers. The right of individual workers to sue for damages was established as a result of the Radium Girls cases here and in Ottawa, Illinois. Next, please. During its years of operation, US Radium processed about 1,000 pounds of ore daily and dumped it on the site. The abandoned factory was designated a Superfund site, sort of a Superfund site, by the EPA in 1983. From 1997 through 2005, the EPA remediated the West Orange site, as well as 250 residential and commercial properties that had been contaminated in the intervening decades as sort of landfills from the Radium Corporation. Some of these were in Montclair, where soil from the radium factory had been used as landfill. Next, please. In 2011, or some years earlier, a junior high school student in Ottawa, Illinois, heard about the Radium Girls, and she wanted to do something about it. Next slide, please. Her name was Madeline Pillar, and by the time she was in high school, she had gained enough supporters to encourage the city to dedicate a statue to the Radium Girls in Ottawa. The girl holds a flower in her right hand, which is hard to see in this picture, and her left hand, a small paintbrush. And some of the women, many of the women survived, and some of the women who survived came to the opening ceremony of this, and you can see pictures of that on the internet. And what we're going to do now is something that isn't quite about New Jersey, but I want to talk for a minute about probably America's worst industrial disaster. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster. This was in West Virginia, near a project called the Gauley Bridge. It's also called the Gauley Bridge disaster. This was during the Depression in 1930, and the task was to create a tunnel to divert a river so that a company associated with American Cyanamid could get power. And as they started to work in this tunnel, using workers, Black men who were unemployed, came up from Georgia and Florida, and of course were badly treated and paid next to nothing and worked 15 hours a day. It was discovered that the sandstone that lined the tunnel was full of silica. So in addition to building a tunnel, they mined silica, which was important in part of the industrial processing of steel. And the men who did the work did not wear masks, the supervisors did, and they used power drills and so forth to chip away at the sandstone. And within months, many of them developed lung disease, which we now call silicosis. They were shipped back to Georgia or Florida. those who remained, many died within months and were buried without ceremony in a nearby field far away from the White Cemetery. The company went on with the project. It's not known how many men died because they couldn't be found. There were a couple of lawyers who were interested, but there were no laws that they could use. Tort reform was inadequate. There were no laws that they could use to compensate the men or their families. Let's see what else I can say about that. They were buried and their graves have since been moved, though they remain nameless. There's about 180 bodies that have been identified and moved. They think there may be as many as 1,000 men who died from silicosis as a result. There were 3,000 workers and they think 1,000 may have died rather quickly in terms of lung diseases. They died within months of silicosis. I think that's probably all I want to say. I might mention that silicosis is called a pneumoconiosis. That's a medical term, pneumo meaning lung, cona being Greek for, I think it's Greek, for dust, and osis meaning a condition. So it's the dust disease is the one you may have heard of. The most, of course, is coal miner's lung. And then there's silicosis, and the one that we're going to talk about now, which is asbestosis. And that takes us to our next slide. And again, back to New Jersey. I mentioned the Gauley Bridge disaster because I thought, first of all, it's interesting, but second of all, there's nothing anyone can do for these men or their families long gone, except maybe remember them. And so I thought we should do that. So we're on asbestos. Now, asbestos, the magic mineral, it was called. Next slide. Asbestos combines the properties of rock and silk. Asbestos is versatile. Combined with magnesia, it can be sprayed on pipes and molded into solid shapes. It was turned into felt insulation, roofing, tiles, thread, and fireproof fabric. At the end of the 19th century, asbestos was the ideal insulator for engines in locomotives, automobiles, and ships. It was also the only available real insulator for this new transportation. This is the original Johns, H.W. Johns. He was 1858, a 21-year-old businessman named Henry Ward Johns established the H.W. Johns Manufacturing Company in New York. Next slide. Johns developed many asbestos products, finding a natural market for building supplies. He used waste short asbestos fibers to produce a fireproof asbestos liquid paint. Presumably your house wouldn't burn down if the paint was fireproof. He died of what was called a dust pneumonitis in 1898, almost certainly asbestosis. In 1901, his heirs merged with Thomas Manville, a Wisconsin asbestos insulation manufacturer, to form the H.W. Johns Manville Corporation. And those of you who are from New Jersey will easily recognize this, the name Johns Manville. Next, please. And here's some of the plastic stove linings, coverings of pipes being installed with using the Manville or the Johns products. Next, please. I guess this is what you call strip mining. The early asbestos, this is the biggest asbestos mine in North America. It's in Quebec. The city near it is called Asbestos. These are the Thetford mines. There's no longer any asbestos being mined there, obviously, but the city recently, I understand, has decided to keep the name asbestos and now has a sort of ski resort as its industry. Next, please. Here are some miners, probably from the early 20th century, and they're using pickaxes to get the asbestos out of these mines. Next slide. As technology moved along, the miners of asbestos were exposed to more and more asbestos with these mechanical drills. And you just see the vapor, not the vapor, the clouds of asbestos coming up and presumably lodging in their lungs. Next, please. There are many different, not many, several different types of asbestos. This is chrysotile asbestos, and you can see the fibrous nature of this mineral, and imagine how these fibers could get in the lungs if they were disturbed. Next. It was called the magic mineral, the mineral of 1,000 uses. And you can see that World's Fair exhibit and something called asbestos fluff. Yes, you can even see the words magic mineral under the asbestos man in the 1939 World's Fair. And the fluff, it seems, it was made into various industrial materials. Next, please. Pardon the poor quality of the slide. Certainly for insulation on trains, asbestos was very useful. Next. Sprayed insulation. I think the people in the left-hand picture weren't even wearing masks. The man in the right-hand picture may have been a little later on was wearing a mask. How effective that was, I don't know. And but at least he was wearing a mask. Next. The building supplies, the asbestos walls, shingles, so that your roof wouldn't catch on fire. And you can see the name down there, Johns Manville. The two companies came together, and we'll see about the factory in a few minutes. Next. Brake linings, obviously very important in the age of transportation. Next. It wasn't only men, it was women who did some of the tasks. There was asbestos fluff and asbestos thread. And when asbestos began to affect the asbestos workers at Manville, their wives who washed their work clothes, some of the wives came down with asbestos-related diseases. Next. And that's the prior fireproof suit. I'm not sure what Meccano magazine is, but 1940, what is it, 1940 something, the asbestos suits. Next. The Liberty ships, the ships that won the war, were vital to the American war effort. Oversight and knowledge was limited. Asbestos was the critical and only insulator for engines and other parts of ships and airplanes. Many shipyard workers can be counted among the delayed casualties of war. And note in this other picture down below, oh my goodness, look at the pictures on the wall. I didn't know that. Sorry about that. Anyway, he's reading a magazine, no doubt something, intellectual, and lying underneath an asbestos covered pipe in his ship. Next. Perhaps the most, well, I'll get to that in a minute. And also for the children, around the Christmas tree, you could have asbestos snow so that they would feel that they were, feel in a cold, maybe if they were in a warm climate, it felt that there was snow around them. Next. In 1912, the Johns Manville Company built a company town in Hillsborough, Somerset County, New Jersey. In 1929, the area around the plant was incorporated as Manville. It's about, 30 miles from where I am standing at the moment. It was a company town, if ever there was a company town. Next. The company helped the men get houses at a reasonable price, $75 per lot, which is a reasonable price for those days. It provided benefits for many of its workers. It was a paternalistic company. It gave them working material, building materials to take home. It had company picnics and that sort of thing. And many of these men came from the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania. They were used to jobs that caused death. And for them, Manville was heaven. They got out of those horrible mines. They weren't crushed under the mines. They didn't get coal miners' lung. And even when asbestos became known as something that was causing them to become ill, they really were not, as a group, protesting. They still remained somewhat loyal to the company. Next, please. Just a picture of the anthracite coal mines. I'm sure you can imagine that. It was a terrible life, and children would start into the coal mines when they were 10 or 12 years old as pit boys. Next. That is the Johns Manville plant. You can see the rail lines. You can see the multiple buildings. It was a gigantic industry. And I don't know what's left of it. Maybe if there's somebody from Somerset County, I don't think there's very much left of it at all. There was a large company in England, the Turner Newell Company, which also had the same kind of health problems. Next, please. Well, I call this the Asbestos Hotel. There was an asbestos hotel on Main Street in Manville. It was used for visitors, but it was also used as a dormitory for unmarried male workers. But there really was something called the Asbestos Hotel. Next. Johns Manville really became the industry giant, certainly in America. When you think of asbestos, you think of Manville. That was sort of their credo. There it is at the bottom. When you think of asbestos, you think of Johns Manville, which turned out to be very unfortunate for the company and for the men. Next, please. This is probably a fairly normal lung. I'm not a pathologist. All the little red dots are red blood cells in a blood vessel. Those are normal. All the little blue dots look like cell nuclei. And at sort of the 2 o'clock position, you can see a long, narrow strip sort of pointed upwards at 45 degrees. That's an asbestos fiber lodged in the lung, which in this particular case may or may not be causing the disease of whoever's lung biopsy or pathology slide this is. But that is the fibers in the tissue, and it's the fibers that cause the problem. Next. Well into the 1950s, tuberculosis was the most feared lung disease, but evidence of asbestos toxicity was slowly accumulating. Reports of pulmonary asbestosis, that's the condition of the scarring and the inflammation. It's not malignant, but it can kill or maim because of the fibers replacing the normal oxygen transporting mechanisms of the lung, the structures. Reports of pulmonary asbestosis and lung cancers were suppressed by company officials. They had their own laboratory, which is producing evidence of toxicity, and they did suppress the information. Asbestos fibers were found under the microscope in lung tissue from asbestos-exposed victims of lung inflammation and lung cancers. And that's the picture that I showed. Next, please. Oh, go back. I'm sorry. Chest x-ray. Yeah, you see the heart in the middle, of course, and the sort of haziness where there should be mostly, the upper parts of those lungs are largely black on this x-ray, which is normal. And all that white haziness out to the sides is scar tissue, is fibrous tissue, asbestosis. The asbestos exposure increased the risk of lung cancer in smokers by a factor of 7 to 8 times. The company said, well, they were smoking, and they knew at that time that smoking could cause lung cancer, but the incidence of lung cancer was 7 to 8 times in those who were also exposed to asbestos. Next. So who was the cast in what turned out to be the asbestosis drama? By 1933, executives with Johns Manville knew they had a problem. Increasingly, workers were contracting asbestosis, and some were demanding compensation. Some company doctors and scientists who served as scientists rather served the company rather than the workers, allowing their findings to be edited by management. Industry leaders engaged in stalling and manipulation to protect their profitability. As accusations increased, Johns Manville positioned itself as a beleaguered giant reeling under the burden of mass litigation. It certainly was reeling under the burden of mass litigation. The company blamed the Navy for failing to regulate shipyards, but in fact, the data available to the Navy was really very scant, and the mission was to win the war. And Congress for failing to enact workmen's compensation programs, and insurance companies for failing to pay claims, and employees for smoking and refusing to use filters and masks. Meanwhile, government regulators struggled to establish the standards with very limited data. So there was a period of some confusion. Next. In the 1960s, Irving Selikoff, a New Jersey lung specialist, a private physician, not affiliated with the company, identified lung scarring and cancers in insulation workers, not the producers of the asbestos products, but the guys who were spraying this stuff and installing installation made with asbestos. He identified lung scarring and cancers in insulation workers who had never worked for Johns Manville. In some cases, their lung diseases seemed to develop decades after exposure to asbestos. He also found that a number of the insulation, of course, the company wouldn't let him anywhere near their offices or their data. He also found that a number of the insulation workers had an extremely rare type of cancer that had most doctors never saw it. Case reports, if you found a case, it was worthy of a case report in a journal. A type of cancer in the tissue surrounding the lungs and some of the abdominal tissues, and that was called mesothelioma. For those of you who made your way through COVID by binge watching heaven knows what at night on television, as I did, You can now mesothelioma is a well-known word. And indeed, many of the people who are developing mesothelioma were exposed decades earlier, which really made the laying the blame a little more complicated. Selikoff's work pressured OSHA to limit workplace exposure to asbestos. And he was sort of a giant figure. When I was at Mount Sinai as a medical student, he addressed our class, but I didn't realize he was such an important person. So I do remember hearing him speak, though. Next. Public awareness grew over the next few decades. Litigator used legal discovery to take down the asbestos industry. After successful lawsuits from many directions, Johns Manville filed for protection under Chapter 11 of the US Bankruptcy Code in 1982, and a multi-billion-dollar compensation package was established. Next. Today, and again more often late at night, the public face of asbestos-related lung disease, especially mesothelioma, reaches us through television ads by specialized law firms. Though I must say there's one company that keeps saying you get a free book. Well, I'm sure the people suffering from mesothelioma could care less about a free book, but there are funds available, and the legal experts on this, you really need a legal expert to work their way through the maze and hopefully get some compensation for the men and their families. This is a very difficult type of malignancy to treat. And these people are often older because it's been 30 years that their disease was developing. And I believe there is considerable compensation available now. Okay, next. Well, asbestos, the face of asbestos now is remediation, and arguments about whether, for example, every American elementary school or high school built before 1950 probably has asbestos somewhere. So the question is, should you tear down the walls or leave it covered? And for the most part, I think not all the walls are being torn down. Also, the money and the funds for asbestos remediation are somewhat limited at this time. But you can see there the rotting asbestos on one of the pipes. Obviously, the workers now are heavily protected, and they're presumably cleaning up some of the asbestos sites. Next, please. Oh, there is no next. Okay, I just want to take another few minutes before we open it to questions, which hopefully I can maybe answer, though. And we have a number of specialists in occupational lung disease in our audience, and maybe they'll help. We're going to talk about the Superfund sites. I was prompted to find out about Superfund sites in Monmouth County, where Middletown is. As of March 2016, New Jersey, incidentally, was the leading state in number of Superfund sites. I'm not sure we can be very proud of that. New Jersey had 114 sites, followed by California with 97 and Pennsylvania with 95. Monmouth County had about 9 or 10 sites. There was a lot of dumping of waste materials in the Pine Barrens, which I understand are near Monmouth, and in other areas, something called Bog Creek Farm. There's Burnt Fly Bog in Marlboro. Those areas are being cleaned up. The funds are beginning to run out for the Superfund sites. Something called the Lone Pine Landfill, the Naval Weapons Station, and a couple of farms. I don't know what was dumped on the farms. Several things in Wall Township, and a few things have been cleaned up. So Monmouth County probably got off reasonably lightly. And I think that's about all I have to say before I turn it back to the moderators. Moderator.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Moss. It was definitely interesting.
Yes, it was fairly gloomy, I'm afraid. This is hardly a cheerer upper, but
I didn't want to say that, but yeah, it was also interesting.
I mean, there's no upside of this.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, we found the best method is to please enter it via the chat function, and I can relay it to Dr. Moss. So if you have a question, please enter it in
I only
there.
see one, so that might be, I don't know what that is. Somebody says hi.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I saw that. I have a couple, if you don't mind. What generated your interest in this topic?
Well, I've a long time been interested in the history of medicine in New Jersey, which, if you read national histories of medicine in the United States, New Jersey doesn't get an enormous amount of press. We had no teaching hospitals or no medical schools for a long time. And I was very interested in the various things that affected New Jersey. One of our audience members is an expert in lead poisoning in New Jersey and wrote authoritatively about that. And so, you know, sort of here it was, pollution. We're in New Jersey. I'd heard about Manville. And it just seemed something I wanted to put together. I'm no expert in industrial diseases, but Dr. Wadeen, who's in our audience, is indeed an expert in lead poisoning as an industrial disease and has written extensively about it.
Okay. We have a question here. Somebody says his sister recently did not go through with a home purchase because it was older and there could have been asbestos.
Well, if it's older, there probably is
worry for people?
asbestos. I don't, you know, my ceiling collapsed in the kitchen about 2 years ago, and the workman thought he saw asbestos up there. So I walked around wearing an N95 mask for a week and not going in my kitchen. And fortunately, it was not there. I'm not sure. I think a lot of people, even if there is asbestos, might just leave it. And I suppose the inspector who inspects the house for the buyer possibly should be asked that question, whether he finds asbestos in the house. I don't know if that would be a reason to not buy a house. There's probably asbestos in most American schools somewhere. And yeah, good luck to your sister, because I may be buying or selling a property, so I'm hoping that doesn't come up either. But thank you for making me more upset than usual.
Yeah, it's something we all have to deal with. Have you ever treated anybody affected by
I have seen, when I was working in something called Raritan Valley Hospital, which was near Somerville, I was rotating through the lung. I think I was a resident or something. And a man came in who had worked in Manville, and he was a typical Manville worker. He said, "You should have seen it. The dust was so thick, we couldn't see our hands before our faces." It was almost as if, you know, he wasn't proud, but it was just the way it was. And he had come in for pulmonary function testing. But I didn't personally treat him, but I have met several of the people from Manville. And I do know that several of the women who washed the clothing, as I mentioned earlier, developed asbestos. There's always this argument, is one fiber enough? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but you don't need an enormous load of asbestos fibers in the lung to cause either asbestosis or lung cancer. It can be a very light, you know, sort of light dusting, so to speak.
Okay. Randall Gabrielle is thanking you for this presentation, and he also recommends the Medical Society of New Jersey for their informative programs. So if anyone's interested, check them out as well.
Yes, we do Zoom programs. The Medical History Society of New Jersey will be happy to, if you give us an email, we'll be happy to, you can look us up at our website, and we give talks every month by Zoom at the moment.
Okay, we have another question here. Since 1930, a popular dish pattern was fiesta. Dishes were of various colors. As a child, my brother built his own Geiger counter, discovered that orange plates were radioactive. Are you familiar with
I'm
this?
not familiar with it. Is there anybody who knows what pigments might? It was obviously some sort of pigment related to an ore of some sort. Would anybody know what might be in the paint? I don't know about the food that you ate off the plate, but no, I don't. But that sounds good for your brother, I guess. Yeah, it must have been some sort of paint, an ore-derived paint of some sort.
Would comment, Tom's River by Dan Fagan is an interesting book about contamination in the 1950s.
Yeah, what was the contamination in Tom's River? Was it asbestos? We know?
I don't know, maybe they can elaborate in their comments.
Yeah.
We have another comment.
Oh, there it is,
uranium
salts. Ah.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So it was the dye in the paint. I think Tom's River had a lot of toxic landfills. In fact, yes, there was a question, I'm sorry, I read a book about it. There were a number of childhood cancer cases in Tom's River. And the issue was whether the statistics were sufficient to link it to the landfills. There was a farm in particular where Union Carbide, the folks who brought us Bhopal, and although there's also the people involved in the mine in the tunnel that I mentioned earlier, dumped a lot of their waste in this landfill near Tom's River. And that has been, of course, the victims' families feel that it was all the toxic landfills. And the question is whether this can be proven statistically. So yes, I think that, I'm sorry, I forgot about Tom's River. And the toxins were multiple. They were just tanks or drums full of whatever Union Carbide was producing. They were just dumped there on somebody's farm. It was a big, I'm sure that's a major industrial cleanup site in New Jersey.
Are there any other products around today that you think somebody like you will be talking about 30 years from now?
I don't think I'll be talking at all 30 years from now, unless you have a geriatric division. But anyway, yeah, I'm sure we're going to find something. And I mean, so yeah, there'll be something. And you know, with the modern methods, it may not be necessary to have the burden of disease that was required before people woke up and realized that smoking could cause lung cancer, or that asbestos could do this or that. I mean, these were major, major things that were very obvious, but I'm sure there'll be something. Let's see, somebody from Rutgers, oh, Ron Becker. Ron Becker was the archival librarian at Rutgers, and a good friend and a wonderful source of information on everything to do with New Jersey history. I guess we can we hear Ron? I'll just read what he wrote. When I was at Rutgers, we provided evidence from our archives for a class action suit, KALO, K-A-L-O, a combination of asbestos and fiberglass at a factory in Sayreville, New Jersey. So librarians do us a great service. Karen Reeds, who's also one of our medical historians, says she reminded me that in the mid-1970s, the New Yorker published a powerful article about asbestos. I was a postdoc at Bryn Mawr College in a tiny office closet with an asbestos insulated pipe in it. Every time I moved my chair, it scraped the insulation. And she insisted that they cover it up. And good move, Karen. We're glad you did. Any other, I'm just seeing them as they come up. Any other comments?
Anybody else have any questions? Comments?
Comments? Things to, okay.
All right, looks like that might be about it for right now, at least.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, and again, keep us in mind as you watch late night television and hear about meso, whatever it is, .com. That's what they're talking about.
Sure will. And thank you once again, Sandra.